Prime Minister's Question Time, which is now the only parliamentary occasion which seems to me to retain any adversarial content whatever, is all about personality. It's a soap opera each week. Who can insult the other one more effectively about his personal failings? It doesn't have any political content. It's not designed to have any political content. And you actually have moments where senior figures in one party praise senior figures in the other. David Cameron's been doing it quite a lot to people like Alan Milburn and Lord Adonis, and quite a lot of the New Labour people reciprocate it by muttering proudly that David Cameron is not at all a bad chap. And this is what they really think. It's what they really mean. They are more or less the same. Mr. Cameron said in an unwise moment of candour that he was the heir to Blair. It's perfectly true. And quite a lot of people would like to, as it were, pass the mantle of Blair over Mr. Brown's puzzled head straight to David Cameron, and one can almost see it happening at the moment.
And you see,
it won't work.
Quite a lot in of the book is devoted to the way the media deals with and reports politics, and there's a lot that rings true in the charge that political reporting has almost become a branch of sports reporting about the personalities, about who's up, who's down, who's sideways, what new tactics are being deployed. Is the media class, in your view, part of the conspiracy with the political class?
Well, calling it a conspiracy is always going to make people think that you're being silly. What's certainly the case is that these people live in each other's pockets, and they live in each other's restaurants, and they spend an awful lot of time together cranking up each other's rumours and gossip for their own purposes. What I experienced in the years when I was a political reporter back in the 1980s was that it was quite extraordinary how uninterested in politics everybody was. I look back on those years with amazement when I read the Acts of Parliament which were passed when I was there. I didn't notice any of this going on. I had no idea what the government was doing, because we were all completely obsessed with who was up, who was down, who was out, and who was in, and what faction was triumphing. And it had absolutely nothing to do with politics. And there's a very short-sighted, almost microscopic view of politics in the reporting of politics these days, where people simply cannot see the wood for the trees. And there are other elements in this. I think that it eventually becomes the case, when a government's been in office for a long, long time, that there are an awful lot of hungry, ambitious younger reporters who are very anxious to see a change of government, so that their contacts, who they've lunched so expansively for so many years, finally become ministers.
I mean, this is one of the interesting things about the dynamic you detect in the book driving the media's attitude to politics. They wanted Blair, now you say they want Cameron.
Yeah. And they want Cameron in many cases because for them it's the beginning of, it will be, they hope, the beginning of a wonderful new career for them, when they will be receiving constant government leaks which will enhance their status in their own newspapers and news organisations. Of course they are. It's unreasonable not to assume self-interest on the part of people. I don't blame them for being self-interested, but anybody who studies political reporting should be aware of the fact that these influences are at work, and of the enormous power of lunch, which is a title of a small chapter in the book. People should understand just how important these incessant lunches between political journalists and politicians are.
Because another of the themes in the book is that while you are not exactly an enthusiast for what the current Labour government has been doing under Brown, under Blair before him, you don't see salvation in the arrival of a Prime Minister Cameron in number 10.
Well, no, because it's not a political change. What we're being offered is change without alteration. That the British political system will be under new management, but it won't take a new direction, precisely because everyone's being diverted into this issue of personality, into the issue of competence, into what was in the major years the issue of sleaze, and is now whatever you care to describe the morass into which British politics has wandered as. But these things are not actually about, is the country being properly governed? They're not. They don't touch on the debates which increasingly trouble millions of people. How on earth are they going to afford to pay the enormous taxes levied on them? How on earth can their neighbourhood cope with the burden of mass immigration? Is anybody going to do anything about the levels of crime and disorder which plague them? Can anyone expect a reasonable education from a state school unless they live in a very expensive part of town? All these things are the real preoccupations of people, and politics simply doesn't address them at all. It has nothing to say to any of these people, and as a result it leaves all these issues increasingly to disreputable demagogues, because respectable, serious mainstream politics has abandoned them.
And you yearn in the book for a true Conservative party. What would that be like?
Well, I also yearn for a truly radical party. I want there to be people who stand up and say, yes, we do actually want to undermine marriage. Yes, we do believe in mass immigration. We do want to dissolve the country into a European superstate, instead of pretending that they don't. and diverting the population with initiatives and gimmicks. I would like there to be a party which actually stood up and said openly, this is what we want to do. I think the party that I would like would be the one which dealt with the issues I just mentioned, which seriously wanted to restore rigor in education, which actually said we do believe that criminals should be punished for their wrong acts instead of being treated or crime being treated as a disease which was the result of child abuse and poverty, which it plainly isn't. And I would like to see a political party which said actually we would like to govern our own country. We don't want 80% of the legislation going through Parliament to be rubber stamping European Union directives as it is now. We'd like to decide for ourselves, thank you very much, how we arrange our own affairs, and indeed our foreign affairs as well. All these things badly need to be said. They badly need to be said by respectable political figures. But as long as they're not said, they don't get raised, and they become the property, as I say, of dangerous demagogues who lurk on the fringes of our politics at the moment in a quite menacing posture.
Doesn't all this, though, rather seem to hark back to a golden age that never quite was?
Nope.
I'm not convinced at all that the British politics has always been sharp ideological distinctions until this degenerate modern age. Most of the time, I think, the Whigs and the Tories, the Liberals and the Conservatives of the 19th century, the distinctions were as much tribal as anything to do with ideology or issues.
Well, there is a big change. And the big change is this: the British left-wing politics has moved into a very ideological phase. It began with the Fabians. It intensified, I think, very much when the how shall I say, the sympathizers of Marxism first made themselves felt in the labour movement between the wars. It became even more ideological when the products of the 1960s university revolution started coming into politics. And there are a lot of them, of my generation, who are not really very...
Well, you were one of them.
Well, I was one of them, but I've stopped being one of them.
You were an international socialist.
Indeed, I was.
And you're living proof that it is possible not to have lifelong contamination from a fling with Trotskyism.
Indeed, and the interesting thing is that I get a lot of stick for it. And what strikes me quite forcefully many times is I'll find myself on a panel with a Labour minister who rails at me about this. And I say, well, I make no secret of it. I put it in my Who's Who entry that I worked for the Socialist Worker. No one could be in any doubt. These people were also, in many cases, members of revolutionary organisations, and they keep very quiet about it indeed. Why is that? Because it still matters to them. They're still influenced, particularly by...
Maybe they're embarrassed by it.
Well, no, they're not. They're only embarrassed by it because it reveals something important about them. It doesn't reveal anything important about me. You can't tell anything about me from the fact that I used to be a Trotskyist, except that I used to be one. In their case, what you could possibly gather from it is that they still have quite a lot of radical thought. And they're in the Labour Party, and actually they're in the Tory Party as well. And they continue to believe in some fairly radical prescriptions for politics and society. And they could, and as a result of this, the Conservative Party, which has always rather sort of how should I say, rotundly pronounced itself as a disposition, not a dogma, and said we don't have any ideology, we have no need for it, has encountered a ruthless opposing force, which is absolutely the reverse of a disposition, which is a dogma, which proceeds year by year, every moment it's in office, along dogmatic channels. And if you're not prepared to challenge those things, then there's only one thing you can do, and that's compromise with them. And the problem with the modern Conservative Party is that rather than develop an intellectual challenge to the left, it's either failed to understand it or it's given into it. And the Conservative Party in its present form would guillotine the Queen if it thought that it would get into office by doing so. It has no ideological bottom whatsoever. If you're fighting ideological people, you need at least to have a counter-ideology. They have none.
Let me quote to you the words you use in the beginning of your concluding chapter. When Britain dies, which is likely to happen soon. I mean, having spent a great deal of time in the book talking about our national resilience and the strengths of the British character, you now seem to be assuming that we're all doomed because someone read Marcuse in a university in the 60s.
Well, I don't actually talk very much about national resilience or the strength of British character. These are things which are very much in the past, and I think that they've been severely undermined by the Cultural Revolution which we've undergone. This is my third essay into trying to understand what's happened to this country. My first was written 10 years ago, and called The Abolition of Britain, and it went very much into the...
not yet been abolished, as far as I've noticed.
Well, it all depends what you mean by abolished. How much national independence do we have? Do we anymore have an independent foreign policy? Do we conduct an independent trade policy? Is our Parliament actually as a sovereign legislative chamber? Is our law made solely on our own territory? No, none of these things is true. And the simple practical facts of absorption into the European Union and the acceleration of it, especially once this Lisbon Treaty is finally ratified, which I think it probably will be after the Irish do what they're told to do and vote no in October, the moment will come when it's perfectly clear, even to people who don't want to pay attention, that we are actually largely governed from abroad. The extirpation of our national culture, of people's knowledge of their own history, is also very, very serious. And without that, without a knowledge of your own history, you cease to exist as a nation, just as a person dissolves when their memory goes. It's a kind of national Alzheimer's we're undergoing.
My problem with all these arguments, though, is I suspect if you went back to the reign of Henry VII or something, you could find at roughly 15-minute intervals books saying that we're all doomed and that our nation is degenerating and that we're falling into some terrible pool of forgetfulness and we're losing all our national virtues. Would be that.
You produce them for me, and I'll tell you why there's no parallel. But in their absence, I'll just tell you that there isn't any parallel. There is a material, measurable loss of national sovereignty. And there is an almost equally measurable loss of national self-confidence, national culture, knowledge of the national history, pride in and understanding of national institutions, which betoken to me a country in the final stages of dissolution. It's not wholly unrescuable. If I thought it were wholly unrescuable, I'd give up. But I think unless you point out just how very close we are to this point of dissolution and sound a fairly loud alarm, people are not going to take it seriously in time. And that's my job.
Well, it's a very loud alarm that you've sounded, Peter Hitchens. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. And Book Talk will be back again next week. Join us then.